clinical research and advocacy interests lie along the intersections of reproductive and behavioral health. He wears many hats. He is Associate Medical Director at Friends Research Institute. He is the Deputy Chief Clinical Officer at the Department of Behavioral Health in the District of Columbia. And he's adjunct faculty at the University of California, San Francisco, where he is a substance use warm line clinician for the National Clinician Consultation Center. Many will recognize that consultation center as one of the many resources in your team resources folders. Dr. Terplan is also a consultant for the National Center on Substance Abuse and Child Welfare and the Addiction Medicine Specialist for Virginia Medicaid. He has active grant funding and has published over 120 peer-reviewed articles with emphasis on health disparities, stigma, and access to treatment. He's spoken broadly on issues related to gender and addiction to diverse audiences ranging from local high schools to the United States Congress. And he's participated on expert panels with CDC, SAMHSA, ONDCP, OWH, FDA, and the NIH. And we're thrilled to welcome him into this space as well. So thank you for joining us today, Dr. Terplan.
Thank you, and thank you so much for having me. I'm gonna click yes. I'm gonna share my screen, give me a second. Perfect. So thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here and talk on this. I wanted to begin that title that you have. This is my disclosure. None are standard, but I have two. One, this is a photo of my mother when she was pregnant with me. You can see her smoking a cigarette, drinking alcohol, and she was an English teacher, and she used to like this phrase. She used to say, alliteration is a cheap form of creativity, and in her honor, I have like really one of the most alliterative titles that I have ever come up with. So I wanted to begin and talk about like, what is the child? And the child in Western Europe and in parts of the United States is really, and it comes to being in the mid-17th century during the period, of the Enlightenment. And it's this idea of the child as innocent, pure, associated with divinity. And you can see from this Rousseau quote, why rob these innocents of the joys which pass so quickly? Why fill with bitterness the fleeting early days of childhood, days which will no more return for them than for you? So this idea of childhood as pure and as innocent was not, even at this time, extended to all children. In the United States, this was the era of slavery, and throughout, after slavery, anti-Black racism really constructs certain children as being more innocent than others. And even today, there's no end of headlines of children oftentimes in their school being arrested, being pepper sprayed, being handcuffed by the police force that is present in their spaces of education. So as from the 1700s to the 1800s, there's a marked, increase in immigration to the United States, and in particular, from Southern and Eastern Europe. And those people were not considered white and did not fit into this paradigm of power and of control. And there was an explosion of child poverty and poverty in general, in particular in the East Coast cities. And there were people such as like Charles Brace, who was a philanthropist who's considered the father of the modern foster care movement, who described these children as, street rats and other, real pejorative terms, and set up a system of what were called orphan trains. And these were trains that left New York City, traveled to upstate New York, traveled out through the Midwest, traveled to Texas, and even out to California. And every stop along the way, children were quote unquote adopted, usually to white rural farm families where they exchanged their labor for a room and board. And over this period of time, over 250,000 children, all of whom were many were born in the States, but to parents from Eastern and Southern Europe, were removed and placed into these other contexts. Now, some other types of children were not even considered eligible for orphanage or for adoption. And these were Native American children. And during this period of time too, which is like the early era of the child welfare system, we had a policy of really genocide by assimilation through boarding schools for American Indian kids. And you can see here this quote from Captain Richard Henry Pratt, who was a well-known officer in the so-called Indian Wars, who opened one of the first schools. If you kill the Indian in the child, you save the man. And you can see here the picture on the right. These are children when they entered into the boarding school who really had their culture erased, both through image and through learning. This is places that people were not allowed to speak their native languages and et cetera, in order to really form a particular image of what the United States is. So I bring this up because I want to sort of set this conversation on a couple of themes that emerge from history. One is this idea and this sort of unstable footing, really, of the child as innocent and vulnerable, which sort of implies a guilt or culpability of parents, but that this paradigm maps onto deserving versus undeserving groups of people. The second thing is to really highlight poverty and highlight that child welfare in its historic origin was a response to poverty. But that too has a tension. There is empathy for some poor neglected children, but at the same time, we do see poverty as a product of an individual immoral character. And finally, this history illustrates how child welfare really was a means of exerting and maintaining power, and in particular, white supremacy. So around the turn of the century, into a large extent due to the growing both abolitionist movements and women's suffrage movement, there is a criticism of, or people trying to think of alternatives to adoption, to orphanages, to boarding schools. And building on the model of Civil War widow pensions, there was several decades in which there were mothers' pensions were given, cash payments to women, with dependent children. In many ways, we would talk about this today as like a living wage. And this is a rather incredible period of time. In 1912, the Children's Bureau is established within, the Department of Labor. And initially, it's actually directed, managed, staffed almost entirely by women, in particular by white women. And they utilize social research to inform public policy. And the earliest sophisticated detailings of both maternal and infant mortality date from this period of time. And they paid particular attention to the role of poverty in maternal mortality, as you can see from this table here. And these data informed something called the Shepard-Towner Act that existed in the United States from 1921 to 1929. And this act was designed to reduce infant and maternal mortality. This story should sound very familiar to what we talk about right now in public health. And the way this act was, what the act paid for was public health nursing, visiting nursing, childcare, increase access to prenatal care, as well as the regulation and licensure of midwives. So this act was part, like following the Flexner report, of sort of the decline of midwifery in the United States in the early part of the 20th century. Now, interestingly, this act was not renewed in 1929, mostly due to resistance from the American Medical Association that saw this act. One, it rejected the women in the Children's Bureau, thinking instead that the management of maternal child health should be in the control of men and through the Public Health Service Corps. Two, the American Medical Association saw this act really as a socialist threat to its professional autonomy. But there was a group of people, actually the pediatric section of the AMA, that was in favor of this act. And they broke from the AMA, and that is the origin story of the American Academy of Pediatrics. So I'm going to skip over much of the mid part of the 20th century because the issues of child poverty and response sort of come and go. But really, I want to shift and focus in a little bit on CAPTA. So CAPTA actually emerges in the statute, the Child Abuse Prevention Treatment Act, emerges from the ashes of the Comprehensive Child Development Act, which was passed with great bipartisan support in 1971 and vetoed by Nixon, as this is the headline in the New York Times here that says this. This act would have opened up child care centers throughout the United States and funded on a sliding scale, making child care accessible to all. And it was Walter Mondale, who was one of the leading authors of that act, who then sort of repackages an approach to child poverty around child abuse. And CAPTA is enacted to provide federal funding to states to support the, quote, prevention, assessment, investigation, prosecution, and treatment of child abuse. So you can see in this history how the federal government shifts away from helping children and families in poverty to really pathologizing poor parents as potential child abusers. And this is the legacy today. Nixon is a transformational president. A lot of the universe, the federal universe we exist in, is built from legislation that passed during his era. And in particular, he is the person who launched the war on drugs. To his credit, and I kind of almost hate to say this, actually he spent more on so-called demand reduction, i.e. treatment and prevention, than he did on supply reduction, which would be law enforcement and incarceration. And it was really under Reagan where that ratio flipped and leading to the era that we're still in of mass incarceration. There are really important parallels between the growth of the child welfare system in the last several decades and the parallel increase in the war on drugs. And in the middle here, you can see this is sort of the growth of the US and federal prison population. And on the top is the population of children removed from their parents' care and placed in the foster system. Increase kind of parallel. And on the right, you can see the growth of spending to both of those. And in fact, there's been a far greater increase in spending to the child welfare system than there even has been to federal drug control. But as illustrated, the prison population in the United States sort of peaked around 2000. And we're in a period of, gradual and too gradual, sort of decarceration. And we're in a period of sort of rolling back parts of the war on drugs in terms of policy, in terms of decriminalization of cannabis and et cetera. However, state policies related to substance use and pregnancy aren't becoming less punitive. In fact, they are becoming more punitive. And almost every single state has placed more punitive statutes, or passed more punitive statutes than have passed less punitive statutes around pregnancy and substance use particularly. And this increase in punitive policy is not driven by overall drug policy, which is bending away from the punitive. It's actually driven by an increase at the state level in other restrictive reproductive health policies. And we have some, data on this. Punitive policies in pregnancy associated with substance use are on the population health level. They lead to later entry into prenatal care, greater rates of preterm birth and low birth weight, and greater rates of neonatal abstinence syndrome. And states that have mandatory reporting laws are actually associated with no change in prenatal care access, preterm birth, or low birth weight. And as mentioned, the increase of infants placed into the child welfare system is driven overwhelmingly by parental substance use, in particular, like maternal substance use. And there are some states, and you can see here in the middle, where over 3% of births are removed during the delivery hospitalization. But I think we need to kind of think about what the child welfare pipeline looks like. And this is a simplified version. There can be a notification, there can be a report, it can go to foster placement, and ultimately, like parental custody can be terminated. And there are inequities and racial inequities at every step along the way. This is a classic article from Ira Chasnoff in 1990, cites a lot, and I'm contrasting that to Sarah Roberts' work in 2011. And you can see in both roughly similar rates of positive urine drug testing between Black and white women, and no real change over time. But you can see the proportion that were reported has increased, and the disparity is actually narrowed, whereas in 1990, 10 times more Black women were reported. Today, or in 2011, it was like twice as many Black women. And this to me illustrates like an important difference between equality and equity. Increasing the number of white women reported to achieve racial parity with Black people, this is not equity. And the goal, so we need to pay attention, but we need to be aware that just reporting more, and especially more white people in the system, does not improve care or health. But the initial report, if you think about the pipeline, is only the beginning. There's 1 in 17 white children in the United States have been removed from care, 1 in 9 Black children, and hearkening back to that history I began with, 1 in 7 American Indian children have been removed from their parents' care. And if you look at sort of the inequality in cumulative prevalence of termination of parental rights by race, ethnicity, which is on the right-hand side here, you see like marked increase when you're contrasting like American Indian or Alaskan Native to white, as well as Black to white, but it differs greatly also by state. So CAPTA. This is a federal requirement that states enact laws mandating reports of known or suspected child abuse to a child welfare agency. And there have been 2 sort of like large amendments to it. The first was in 2003 in response to the hysteria and the sort of false science around crack babies. CAPTA was amended to require states to arrange for plans of safe care for infants affected by, quote, illegal substances. And in 2016, that substance, the illegal, was taken away, but it was expanded to include infants affected by any substance, which has been interpreted to include medications for opioid use disorder, such as buprenorphine or methadone. But I want to note that no funding has ever been allocated to pay for the presumed care that these infants would require in either of these amendments. So the actual language of CAPTA, which I think you're familiar with, is that states must have, quote, policies and procedures, including appropriate referrals to child protection service systems and for other appropriate services, to address the needs of infants born with and identified as being, one, affected by substance abuse or withdrawal symptoms resulting from prenatal drug exposure or a fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And it includes a requirement that health care providers involved in the delivery or care of such infants notify the Child Protective Service system of the occurrence of such conditions. So I want to examine some of the assumptions that underlie this. And the first is, this idea that using drugs during pregnancy leads to child abuse or neglect. Where is the evidence for this? So recently, this is a systematic review that was recently published on this topical area, and their review states that substance-exposed infants definitely have an increased likelihood of child welfare involvement. And I'll unpack that a little bit later. But they did not find strong evidence or only minimal evidence of any sort of substantiated maltreatment in those infants. And overall, they note that the literature is of poor methodologic quality. There are 15 states that define child abuse as prenatal exposure to substances. And this is problematic. And it's problematic from a scientific perspective. This sort of statutory association between substance use in pregnancy and subsequent maltreatment, this is what you'd call a logical tautology. A equals B. Using drugs during pregnancy equals child abuse. This is something that is true or false by definition. It's defined only in reference to itself. In mathematics, people use this term, it's formally undecidable. In science, this is a statement that is not falsifiable, right? It's defined by itself. And things that are not falsifiable are actually not scientific. They're statements of style, not statements of logic or science. The second sort of assumption I think that we carry as providers is that social and legal distinctions equal biological or public health things, that prescribed medications are safer than legal substances and things that are illegal are worse than legal ones. And this is frankly not true. Like, the legal reality is historical and etc., but it doesn't categorically map onto biological harm. In fact, if we think just about teratogens, substances that cause birth defects, ACE inhibitors, alcohol like DES, tobacco, valproic acid, these are more on the prescribed medications and legal substances. And in fact, there aren't illegal substances that are teratogenic. In the conversation I heard just before the break, you guys were talking about screening, which is great. Because another place where like a misperception and exists around the difference between screening and testing and the different strategies that we have. By screening, it's using a validated instrument, talking to a patient, and etc. Testing is looking for the presence or absence of metabolites of particular substances in the biological compartment at a specific point in time. And we can utilize strategies that are selective, i.e. only screening or testing certain people, or universal, screening or testing everybody. And the recommendations, as I heard from the conversation, was delighted to hear, are universal assessment with a validated instrument, not drug testing. And there's lots of problems with drug testing. In part, like, physicians actually do not interpret drug test results very well. These are two articles that use the same instrument. It's a 7-item scale that to me is like at the level of what a medical student should know. And from both of these studies, nobody got 100% right. And in fact, people who prescribed opioids were 1 point fewer correct answers than people who did not prescribe opioids. There's guidance from the American Society of Addiction Medicine on how to use drug testing. And they note, and they use the language of a presumptive test. This would be for a point of care test, one based upon, antibodies and ELISA method. And they note that historically drug testing in addiction treatment has been wielded as a tool for control and punishment. The problems with presumptive tests are, one, the results are binary, positive or negative. Two, they differ greatly by how long metabolites stick around. Three, they only test for certain things and not for other things. And four, they have a high degree of false positives and false negatives. This is in contrast to a definitive test, which would be using, mass spec or something like that, where you get an actual quantity and an identification of the substance. And the guidance for definitive testing is, and it's highlighted here, when the results inform clinical decisions with major clinical or non-clinical implications for the patient. And I would argue that that means any time on labor and delivery. We should be using definitive tests if we are using testing at all. So, for CAPTA and drug testing, is a positive drug test the same as being, quote, affected by substance exposure? Does CAPTA require maternal drug testing at delivery or require newborns to be tested for drug exposure? The answer is no. CAPTA makes it quite clear that affected by is a clinical assessment, and there is nothing in CAPTA that requires people to drug test. Most reports to the child welfare system, in particular for infants under 1 year of age, come from hospitals and from healthcare providers. And looking at the American Academy of Pediatric Guidance and Language, it's quite clear that a positive drug test identifies exposure, but is neither an indication of health or ill health in the newborn. It's not an injury, it's not a harm, and a drug test result is actually not one of the 16-point criteria for hospital discharge. This sort of practice of test and report was called out in December by this ACOG position paper, the opposition to criminalization of individuals during pregnancy and the postpartum period. And they note that policies, and these would be oftentimes hospital policies that require practitioners to respond to substance use and substance use disorder in a primarily punitive way, require healthcare providers to function as agents of law enforcement. And I would say the greatest proximity between policing and clinical care in all of medicine is probably at the time of labor and delivery. So I would recommend that we critically examine urine drug testing. And that if we're going to test, just like any test, it should be with a clear indication. How is the result going to change clinical care? And if it's not, we shouldn't test. If we are going to test, we should have explicit written and verbal consent prior to drug testing of not just the pregnant person, but also the newborn. And part of that consent would be transparency about how that information may or may not be used within the child welfare system. Hospitals should also have clear indications of when to do a drug test. And we need to train people on how to appropriately interpret the results, utilizing definitive testing when needed, because it's quite clear that physicians do not understand how to interpret drug test results. And this is an example. There's several hospitals I know of that are, working through policies like this. This is an example of, indications and contraindications to maternal drug testing from the University of Hawaii. So I said I would also talk about cannabis, and I don't know how to make this transition clean and clear. And really, I want to highlight use cannabis as a way to kind of, one, talk through it, but two, use it as a way to highlight some of these issues around drug testing, reporting, interpretation, and et cetera. So I think we're in this era of, cannabis extremism. In particular, on the one hand, the former Surgeon General issued this advisory about cannabis in the developing brain. Nora Volkoff, who's been the head of NIDA for a long time now, has been writing a lot about the risks of cannabis in pregnancy and amongst reproductive age people. Pregnant women and those considering becoming pregnant should be advised to avoid marijuana or other cannabinoids, either recreationally or to treat nausea. And this sort of prohibitionist perspective is in contrast to this, can cannabis really improve women's health? Of course it can, according to cannabis.net. And items available. These are like THC suppositories, aka the quote weed tampon, that are utilized for the treatment of pain during menses and etc. And this sort of binary extremism spills into the, how people are trying to do research and how they are responding to research. This is a study ongoing at the University of Washington, enrolling people in pregnancy who use cannabis. One, seeing how effective it might be in the treatment of nausea and vomiting, and two, sort of following the infants with some imaging studies to look at different outcomes. And it's gotten a huge pushback across social media. And here's an example. Hey, at Mom's Marijuana, as you offer to pay expectant mothers to use cannabis, will you be informing them of the research findings in at JAMA Psych showing that prenatal maternal cannabis use is linked to psychotic symptoms in kids? Asking for a friend from Tuskegee. So citing, like a horrible instance of, medical experimentation on Black men in the United States when they were purposely given syphilis, not told of it, and followed to understand the natural history of the illness, which in this context. There is some legitimacy to the concern about cannabis. In particular, these are, cannabinoids are small, they're lipophilic, they cross the placenta, they're present throughout the biological compartment. We have cannabinoid receptors almost throughout our whole body. They're expressed early in the fetal brain, and there's concern that sort of exogenous cannabinoids might change, what happens in brain development, in particular the endogenous cannabinoid system, which is linked, to the dopamine system, which is one of the systems involved in addiction, schizophrenia, depression, and etc. But I think it's important to note that brain development does not stop at delivery. In fact, that's only the beginning. And this same concern that is decently grounded in biology exists for childhood and certainly through adolescence in particular. And if we're concerned about the brain and development, we should map that concern on our understanding of how the brain develops, which is throughout not just gestation, but childhood, adolescence until the mid-20s. The second concern really relates to this sort of liberalization and legalization of cannabis and a potential for increase in use. And that makes sense. These are data from Monitoring the Future, which is just a wonderful study since the 70s. And there's, a correlation between whether something is perceived as risky and how much people use it. As marijuana is seen as less risky, more people report use. But does this happen in pregnancy? Well, we asked actually a group of people who were pregnant whether if cannabis became legal, this was in the state of Maryland, would they use more cannabis during pregnancy? And most people actually said no. And the one group of people who said were more likely to say yes were people who were continuing to use cannabis in pregnancy in the first place, not people who quit or not people who never used cannabis. This question, though, about cannabis legalization, we can see from some population health data. These are both one from Washington, one from the state of Colorado. And in both of these, there's been no observed increase in neonatal intensive care unit admission or a decrease in birth weight at the population health level following legalization in either of these two states. But I think this sort of extremist discourse that I laid out earlier really has led us to just not see the basics. These are data from the National Survey of Drug Use and Health, contrasting pregnant to non-pregnant people, looking at, so people who are pregnant, these columns are like, I'm sorry, these are the wrong column headings. They should be flipped. So people who are pregnant report less past month cannabis use, 5% versus 12. However, they report amongst people who use only for medical reasons, that proportion is greater in pregnancy than not in pregnancy. People who continue to use a substance during pregnancy are more likely to meet criteria for a use disorder. 19% of people who are pregnant with past month use meet criteria for addiction, as opposed to only 13% of people who aren't pregnant. But, and this is critical, most people don't receive any treatment, and treatment is not increased during pregnancy. The final thing is really looking at how we misinterpret the urine drug test, in particular for cannabis. Here on the left-hand side is a picture of like a common point of care urine drug test. And you can see on the little ELISA, like dipstick there, it's labeled THC. But it actually does not measure THC. Delta-9 THC is the most common psychoactive part of the plant. What that actually measures is something called carboxy-THC. It is inactive, it's not psychoactive, it's highly lipophilic, so it remains within the biological matrix for sometimes weeks, even months following last cannabis use. So when we look at the drug test and we say, oh, there's THC present, it's not. It's carboxy-THC, not psychoactive, not. Yeah. I want to sort of end-ish by returning to child poverty. And this is a classic photo here from Jacob Rees, titled Street Arabs Sleep in Sleeping Quarters, highlighting sort of pejorative and racist language that we use to describe people who are undeserving or undesirable. And this is from 1888, and these are data here from 2020. Children remain the poorest age group in the United States. 1 in 6 people in poverty are children, and they are overwhelmingly, children of color. 1 in 3 Black children or American Indian children live in poverty, 1 in 4 Hispanic children, and 1 in 11 white children. And when we look at people who are homeless, 1 in 5 amongst all people who are homeless are children. So this is 150 years later than when these images were taken. And despite sort of, like decades of government effort, it's really, even the institutions and the systems we have are failing. Only 1 in 4 eligible households receive federal housing aid. Nearly half of SNAP recipients are still food insecure, and the benefits of SNAP are about like $1.30 per meal. Since 2017, the number of uninsured children has increased by several 100,000 per year, and CHIP enrollment has been decreasing, by 800,000 per year. And early Head Start, which is really one of the most incredible developments in terms of early child development, I think over the last several decades, only serves 8% of eligible infants and toddlers. So I think by focusing on substance exposure, we're actually neglecting child poverty, we're neglecting child development, and we are perpetuating racial inequities. And nothing tells this story better, I think, than the career and research of Halam Hurt, who's pictured here. She was one of the first women to get a NIDA grant to study the effect of cocaine exposure in utero on her primary outcome was IQ. And she found at 2 years of age, the participants in her research study did not differ by IQ based on cocaine or not cocaine exposure. Almost all of the study participants were Black who lived in extreme poverty in Western Philadelphia. And she observed that within that population, there was a range of IQ. And her focus sort of shifted from the substance to the caregiving environment. And she began doing home visits and sort of operationalizing the caregiving environment to identify which factors are associated with high IQ versus low IQ. And these are the factors, that she came up with. Learning stimulation, variety and experience, academic stimulation, language stimulation, all of those things were associated with IQ, and we can problematize how useful that is as an outcome. And the things that really weren't associated were in particular the physical environment, which I would say is the one thing that child welfare home visits focus on more than these other ones. So we have the data about the importance of development and context and nurture. We just don't choose to use them. So in the end, I think what we really need to do is really to reimagine support. What does it look like to really care for people who are pregnant, the dyad, their families, and their communities? And this is an image from that's part of a work in New York State that comes from Movement for Family Power, but that really focuses on autonomy, safety, resilience, financial stability, grounding the work in justice and equity, and being inclusive. Nothing about us without us. And with that, I'm going to stop. This is my contact information. You have the substance use warm line information, and but here it is again. And so I welcome time for questions and etc. And I will stop sharing my screen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Terplan. I have heard you speak many times and learn so much every time. We appreciate this presentation. Folks who have questions or thoughts or reactions, feel free to either chat them in and I can read them off, or also feel free to just come off mute. Any conversation is wonderful.
This is Lisa Hughes from Sterling. I just found it interesting about the marijuana and which ones just metabolite,
we make an assumption based upon how it's labeled that is problematic, and we're making decisions on child welfare notification. Oftentimes we're making breastfeeding decisions based upon this. And I will add to it, nobody has ever looked at what cannabis metabolism looks like in pregnancy. My hypothesis is that the metabolites stick around even longer in pregnancy than they do not in pregnancy. I have had 2 submissions to NIDA to actually look at that, both of which have not been funded. So it's likely that, when somebody says, I don't know why the test is positive, I haven't, used in, 3 months, that could actually be biologically completely correct.
Good to know.
So one question I have is it's very clear that a lot of this work is really about culture change, and the fact that provider education is not keeping up with culture change, and we have so much more work to do in that space. For teams that are really starting to successfully shift this culture, what have you seen is is there like one key thing that has driven success in shifting how we approach this, or are there kind of 5 factors that we should have at the top of our list, or is it really,
Yeah, great question. Thank you. I mean, I think there's a couple, there's a whole bunch of different things to kind of think through. So one is, taking a step back and thinking and reminding ourselves what our roles and responsibilities are as, providers and caregivers, and it's, to support, the pregnant person, to support the dyad, to support, public health. And then thinking about how like policies and procedures, as well as like legislation and oftentimes misunderstanding, does it support or not support that? One, I think it can be very helpful to be inclusive in those policies and procedures and involve people, with lived experience, and people like, and not just have them at the table in a sort of tokenism, and not just have their presence be an excuse for you not to try to see the world through their eyes, but to really, sort of like partner. And there are also people who work in the advocacy space, in your state as well, who can be very helpful in sort of in thinking this through, because I feel like we misunderstand the law. Communication within hospitals, both nursing and physicians, sort of perpetuate sort of a misunderstanding. We don't always stand on, we give on autonomy and support of the pregnant person, and we give up information, like it bleeds very quickly into policing and into harm. And I think all of those can be addressed with much more thoughtful, hospital level policies. And there are increasingly examples of systems, kind of moving towards that. I will add to this, there's a little bit in the state of New York, has a bill that will, it's in committee, but it's a bill that requires a written consent for any drug testing and for any screening related to substance use, both of pregnant people and of newborns. And it's going to be interesting to see how that unfolds legislatively. So there's even, there's even state work, and your neighbor of New Mexico has sort of rolled back some of the CAPTA, stuff if somebody's receiving medications for opioid use disorder, alternative pathways, and et cetera. I think we need to be, really think about remind ourselves what it is that we do and what our purpose is as providers. 2, resist things that are going to cause harm, and that would be the ethical lens. And 3, work collaboratively to come up with alternatives that actually do what we want to do, which is really help people and help families.
I've noticed a couple of people have come off mute. I'm curious if you have a question. I will keep asking questions.
Sure thing.
You folks will not. So one thing, you definitely touched on this. One thing that has me wondering about, how do we get to this concept? So one major challenge is this multidisciplinary approach. So bringing providers and other services to the table to address this family and this dyad together. And one thing I wonder is, in some scenarios, I could see there being potential conflict in the approach from pediatric and obstetric, or maybe not, conflict is not the right word, but just difference in approach. And I'm curious how we can start to build those multidisciplinary conversations to accomplish this goal of coming together on the same page of what is it that we're trying to accomplish, because we're all trying to do the same.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that, so there's been this other tension in child welfare in particular over the last several decades, and that's been between like family preservation and child safety. And so in, really the 70s, 80s, it was an emphasis on family preservation. In the 90s, due to racist drug policies and caricatures of, like Black motherhood and the crack baby hysteria, the pendulum swung, to emphasize child safety over everything. And now with, like the whiteness of the opioid crisis, it's shifting back towards a little bit towards, sort of family preservation. So I think actually an understanding of history is super important. Context, because if there's anything, it's like, like there's just the really brief run across this that I shared with you is like how we, keep doing the same things over and over again. The second thing would be really looking critically at evidence and at data. What are the harms of substance X? What is the benefit, and contrasted to what? And what is the harm of the child welfare involvement? Like the association between using drugs in pregnancy and neglecting or maltreating your child, that evidence does not, that probably doesn't exist. But we have a whole regime of surveillance in place based upon an assumption that is, due to state statutes, actually unprovable, and as well as like where it has been looked at, like not substantiated. So, and then, all of this is all, it's somewhere, all of us on this call came of age, through the last 50 years of, punitive US drug policies. And so we're all grounded in that history ourselves. And so we assume, certain harms, we assume the legal system exists for a reason. And we assume like certain harms and consequences that, again, aren't really sort of, justified or, in existence. So I think that until like, I think like it's great to have teamwork. Without a doubt, it's great for the team to be multidisciplinary. Pediatricians are a key, partner in all of this, but until we shift the discourse away from drugs and towards things that really matter, I would say like inequity, preterm birth, poverty, and et cetera, until we do that, we're just going to be kind of repeating discourses and frames. And one way to do that, and this is not an original idea at all, is to universalize social work assessment at the time of birth. Like this is something that happens in some countries, and this is something that was proposed in the social work literature in the 1970s. It's not just people who use drugs who need help parenting. It's actually like kind of everybody. And if the only way to get rid of, the stigma, the prejudice, the discrimination that comes with using drugs during pregnancy is by actually universalizing the social work assessment at delivery and, providing things like a living wage, like the mother's pension, providing things like, that were in that, the early, federal legislation in the 1920s to support, mothers and children. And some of that actually is contained in the recent COVID response bill. The $1.9 trillion is there's parts, I am not an expert in that piece of legislation, but there are parts of it that are actually a profound shift back towards, what happened 100 years ago in more directly addressing inequity in society. So I'm hopeful that some of that stuff will actually make a difference. But I think without examining our prejudice and bias, without understanding history, and without like taking drugs out of the equation or keeping it there, but in a real scientifically grounded way, not in the way that we're dealing with it now. That's what we need to do.
Dr. Terplan, thanks so much for this talk. It's hugely helpful. I'm Lisa Becker. I'm an OB hospitalist at Pres St. Luke's, and I'm in Colorado, and marijuana is legal. And we have a lot of people who smoke marijuana during pregnancy. Our hospital policy just doesn't kind of make sense to me, because if they fess up to that, then we're supposed to do a tox screen for other substances. And again, I don't know that that actually changes what we do, especially since marijuana is legal here. But it's corporate policy at HCA here. And I guess I just wondered if you had any advice about how to approach, healthcare administrators about some of this and approaches that you've seen be successful elsewhere. And I also just, if it's not too invasive to ask, it's wonderful that you've studied all this. I wonder if there was a patient or a situation that inspired you to delve into this line of work.
In terms of hospital administration, I mean, this is also, I think, our failure as physicians for taking leadership and letting, and just a lot, because we, I think, as a field wanted money. And have absolved or abdicated the responsibility of care to like a professional class that is, not actually like aligned with our interests or that of the people that we take care of.
Right.
But I do think that I think one thing, is highlighting the harms of the system, and that reporting, oftentimes is more harmful than not reporting, and that it's a regime that's separating families, in particular in this time of increased attention to like racial equity, like disproportionately like harming, Black and brown folks. And other people of color. And so I think that's something that has some resonance. The second is sort of like a cost of care issue, because usually with bundled prenatal care, you're not getting reimbursed for that drug test. The third would be, if you're going to do point of care tests, you should be doing definitive tests. Those cost a whole lot more. And finally, it's like there's, who's in charge of clinical care? It's the clinicians, and we should only order tests if this is a medical student point, right? Only order a test if it's going to change your practice. And there are some vague situations perhaps where the drug test might change the practice of someone who's pregnant, but most of the time we're doing it because of external expectations of reporting. So to briefly answer your second question, I don't know if there was a particular person or moment, but I'll just, when I was a medical student, I worked in a syringe exchange. I set up a clinic that ran concurrent with the syringe exchange to do wound care. We actually had one that was it was run joint with medical students and nurse practitioner students that I set up, and it just took care of women. This was in San Francisco, people who were like dancing in the strip clubs and in South Market. And so I really liked working, with people who use drugs. It just like changed how I looked at the universe. I didn't understand what addiction was. I had no idea about treatment. And I certainly didn't know what recovery was. But I'll tell you one story, and this is like when I started to kind of like probably 10 years later, like begin to understand what recovery might be. I remembered a story from the woman who would like kind of co-ran the syringe exchange, and she was a person in long-term recovery, and she described what it was like. She lived in South of Market, which are like buildings like all from the 20s, and she was like, there was one day that I'd been living there and using heroin for 20 years, and and I looked up. Like after stopping using heroin, I noticed that the cornices of the buildings were all decorated